The young man had always carried a notebook, its pages crowded with words that only he seemed to understand. He worked long shifts in a small cafe, wiping down tables and serving coffee with a practiced smile. But in the quiet hours after closing, he poured his heart into stories. Each sentence felt like a fragile bridge between his inner world and the one outside, and he dreamed of the day when those words would find their place in the hands of readers. But dreams are tender things, easily bruised. The first rejection letter stung, though he brushed it off as a small bump in the road. The second left him quiet for a day. By the 10th, the weight pressed deeper, like heavy stones tied to his chest. Each envelope that arrived with polite dismissals seemed to whisper that his words were not enough, that he was not enough. The young man began to doubt himself. He stayed up late, staring at his own words as if they had betrayed him, wondering if he was simply chasing shadows. Friends encouraged him to be practical, to focus on his steady job, to stop wasting time on dreams that had no guarantee. Their advice carried a kind of logic, and he nodded, though his heart rebelled quietly in the silence of the night. There were mornings when he almost left his notebook behind, convincing himself it would be easier to let go. Yet, something always pulled him back. His stories clung to him like whispers of a truth he couldn't abandon. Still, with each rejection, the question grew heavier. Was persistence noble, or was it foolishness disguised as hope? He often sat alone in the cafe after closing, resting his head on folded arms, wondering if the world had already decided his fate. The bitterness of rejection crept into his veins, and though he tried to fight it, doubt became an unwelcome companion. He didn't yet know that the greatest test of a dreamer is not in their first failure, but in how many times they can rise after falling. For now, he carried the quiet ache of disappointment, uncertain whether to continue or surrender. What he didn't realize was that in the shadows of his doubt, life was preparing to send him someone who would remind him that no is never the end, but often the beginning of a greater journey. The turning point came on an evening when the cafe was nearly empty. An older man sat at the corner table, nursing a cup of tea and scribbling in a worn journal. The young man noticed the handwriting elegant, deliberate, the kind that carried years of practice. Out of curiosity, he asked about it, and the stranger looked up with a gentle smile. The man was a retired teacher who had once taught literature. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, the kind that comes from a lifetime of reading and guiding others. When he learned of the young man's dream, he listened carefully, without interruption, as if every word mattered. For the first time in months, the dreamer felt that his voice did not vanish into the air. The teacher did not offer pity. Instead, he asked to see some of the young man's writing. Nervously, the dreamer handed over a few pages. The silence that followed felt endless. When the teacher finally spoke, his words were both kind and firm. The stories carried raw beauty, he said, but they also carried hesitation as if the writer was afraid to give his full self to the page. He explained that rejection did not always mean failure. Often, it meant the writer had not yet been brave enough to pour everything onto the paper. Those words struck like a spark in dry wood. The young man realized he had been writing with one hand holding back, afraid that true honesty would expose too much of himself. The teacher urged him to face rejection, not as an enemy, but as a mentor that forces one to grow. Every no was not a wall, but a sharpening stone. From then on, the two met regularly. Over steaming cups of tea, the teacher gave lessons not in grammar or technique, but in courage. He asked questions that unsettled the young man. What are you most afraid to write about? Why do you care if the world understands you? Is the dream of writing about fame, or is it about truth? The teacher had given him no promises, only a challenge, to persist until his words no longer trembled. For the first time, the dreamer began to see rejection not as an end, but as proof that he was still in the fight. The days that followed were not easier, but they carried a different rhythm. Rejections still came, sometimes with the same cold sentences that once pierced him, yet now he read them with steadier hands. Each letter was no longer a verdict, but a reminder that he was walking the path of every dreamer who ever dared to try. The young man wrote with renewed fire. He filled notebooks, sometimes writing until dawn, his words flowing unguarded, stripped of the fear that once caged them. His stories grew more honest, more alive. He submitted them again and again, not chasing approval, but honoring the voice that refused to be silenced. Then, one morning, a letter arrived that was different. The envelope felt ordinary, yet inside, the words carried warmth. His manuscript had been accepted. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. All the long nights, the rejections, the doubts, they gathered in his chest and dissolved into tears. He held the letter as if it were fragile glass, knowing it was not just acceptance, but proof that he had endured. The teacher was the first person he told. The old man listened, a smile softening his face, and simply said that this was not the finish line, but the beginning of many more journeys. The young man understood then that the true victory was not in being published, but in never abandoning the dream when it seemed furthest away. Looking back, he realized that the harshest no he had faced was not from publishers, but from within himself, when he nearly surrendered. Overcoming that inner rejection had been the hardest battle, and winning it changed everything. The dreamer had proven that persistence can carve light out of darkness. His journey stood as a reminder to anyone standing at the edge of giving up. A no is only the world's way of asking how deeply you believe, and if you keep answering with courage, eventually, the world must say yes. What matters most is not how quickly we succeed, but how deeply we refuse to abandon the voice inside us that knows we are meant for more. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on your own dreams, and if you feel moved, share your thoughts below, like this video, and subscribe for more stories that inspire.